My name is Shmuley Goldberg. I'm the VP Marketing here at LawGeeks. My experience over the last 15 years couldn't be more different to Anne. I've never been involved with any legal companies or technologies before 4 years or so ago when I started working with LawGeeks. My background before that has been one of automation and technology. I've been working in the retail industries and in the travel industries, which are two of the industries I think are safe to say have been the most changed over the last 10 to 15 years by by technologies as a whole, and by automation and by AI. So my background is one of understanding optimization of processes, building workflows, and automating in order to get things moving.
Well, that's great, Shmuley, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your take on this application in the legal field. So I'm going to turn it over to you to get started.
Great, thank you so much. So we're going to kick off today by talking primarily about contract review automation. Today we're going to be focusing on several parts of this. First of all, the what, when, and why about contract review automation. Then we're going to show a real live demo of what it looks like. So once we've covered the theory, we're going to be diving into a practical application, which really is a hands-on experience of what it looks like and what it does. Then we're going to be discussing briefly whether or not this is something that you might be ready for. And finally, we're going to be going through a couple of questions and answers. I want to strongly encourage at this point that throughout the webinar, anytime you have a question at all, please write it in the question box. Normally, when seeing technologies like this for the very first time, there's a whole plethora of questions which come to mind. Feel free to type them all in and get them all, into the system. And then at the end, we'll be very happy to go through any relevant ones or anything that I wasn't clear about during the webinar itself to explain exactly what is going on here today. So with all that said, let's start talking about contract review automation. We'll start with the what, why, and when. So first of all, what is contract review automation? Essentially, it's a platform for reviewing and approving everyday legal contracts on an ongoing basis. Sometimes it helps to define things by explaining what they're not. So in this case, contract review automation is not contract analytics, which gives you statistical information about your contracts. It's not contract extraction, which is able to pull specific data out of a contract and put it in another system. And it's not contract discovery. So we're not here to review hundreds of thousands of contracts looking for one or two clauses. In a nutshell, the simplest way to explain this in one sentence is that we help you answer the question of, can we sign this contract faster, more consistently, and using fewer resources? So we're talking about incoming or third-party contracts. As they come into your business, this is the day-to-day process of a legal team. Often involves reviewing NDAs, service agreements, purchase orders. These are specifically the type of contracts that we want to automate and enable a computer to take this, so to speak, grudge work off the experienced human lawyers. Now, there's a whole range of reasons why you'd want to do this. Just to start off with, you're dramatically reducing discrepancies. As I'm sure you know, if you send the same contract to two lawyers at the same time, you're going to get different reviews back. Hey, you could even send it to the same lawyer, one on a 10 o'clock on a Monday morning and one 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, and get completely different results. So we're reducing the amount of discrepancies by using an automation and AI. Second of all, you get a much faster turnaround time. Essentially, you are cutting down the total turnaround time of a contract from 7 days or 10 days or 2 weeks to under 1 hour. Third of all, you're increasing the capacity of your legal team without increasing the headcount. So if you have limited budget or limiting hiring capabilities, and you need to be able to do more with less, this is a tool that essentially helps you do that. Next, as we mentioned, it improves consistency, which means that every single time you review a contract, it's lined up with your playbook. You define your legal policies, and you can be sure that everything complies with that. And finally, allows for what we call right work, right level, which means it enables your senior legal staff to be dealing with more strategic things, and more junior members and possibly non-legal members such as contract review members or contract managers, or even procurement teams or sales teams to deal with the contracts themselves. So let's dive in to talk about the components that make up a system like this. There are two main parts to a contract review automation tool. And I want to point out by saying we're talking about R1 today, but there are actually many different vendors out there offering similar solutions, and all of them have very similar components. So even though I'll be showing you a demo of ours, be aware that this is very much vendor agnostic and really can apply to many, many similar solutions. The first is the policy center. This is where you define your legal policies. How do you want to check contracts when they come into your system? The second part is the action center, which essentially is where you take your actions, where you make red lines, where you accept changes, where you approve contracts or escalate them to somebody else. So the policy center, as we mentioned, allows you to digitize your organization's policies. So you get to codify your contract review playbook, so to speak. You can create multiple playbooks, one or more for each contract type that you deal with. It allows you to define which clauses are mandatory and which are unacceptable for every single contract type. And you can even dive into the policies themselves and the clauses themselves and define specific details such as what governing law do we allow and how long does a contract have to be for within the policy center itself. Next comes the action center, as we mentioned, and this is where you actually see those highlighted clauses which are missing or problematic. So this would be where you can see, okay, we have 3 clauses missing. This is what we need to do to change them. And this is how we fix the contract. It also allows you to add or remove clauses that you don't like and edit the contract text itself so that you can get the contract turned around as fast as possible. It includes all the pre-approved language and fallback positions and allows you to approve, export, or escalate the contract within the platform itself. So with all that said, this was very, very interesting, I'm sure, but this was all theory. And this is the part where we'd like to actually, if it's okay, dive into a live example of how contract review automation actually looks. So I'm going to start off here by showing you the playbook editor in the policy center. So here you can see all the playbooks that I have set up. I'm going to now edit the playbook for NDAs that come in on third-party paper for the US region. And again, you can define multiple playbooks for different regions and for different types of contracts. This first column here is my required column. Any legal clause, any concept which is in this first column are things that I say, these should always be there. So I always want to see, for example, a definition of the protected information. This second column here is unacceptable. Anything in this column over here are things that I would say, I would never accept this. For example, I can see over here that I would never accept an indemnification policy within an NDA. This last row over here, is your ignore column. And this basically says, it doesn't bother me if it's there or not. So if I have, let's say, confidentiality of relationship, I don't care, I'll sign it with or without. And you can very simply, by clicking on green and red, define what you want to have in every single contract that you sign. You also have the ability, and this is something which happens a lot in law, to define the it depends criteria. So it's not just enough to say there should be or there shouldn't be an assignment clause. You can define within the contract itself, okay, well, we allow for exceptions, but will only accept it in the case of a merger or in the case of reorganization. Or you can say that prior notice is required, but prior notice has to be greater than 3 months. So you can really drill down within this playbook and define exactly how you would teach, let's say, a junior legal associate or a contract manager how to review a contract. Now, once all this is set up, then comes the fun part. Because after that, any contract that's uploaded to your system is automatically reviewed against the playbook that you create and shows up in the Allgeeks platform like this. And the first thing that I want to draw your attention to is this progress summary. Even though I've just uploaded this contract, I'm already 75% through the process of reviewing this contract. And if you look at your watches now, it's about 1/4 past, and we'll see how long it takes to actually review the contract to get it to a place where it's great. So you'll notice here on the left-hand side, we've flagged all the clauses throughout the contract. The AI has read the contract, understood its contents, and is able to break down each and every paragraph to explain, yep, this should be here and it is here, you're fine. And if I actually click through the contract, as I do, it will find what I'm looking at, tell me if it's okay or not. So I really can just focus on what needs to be fixed. Now, I can see over here there are 5 things in this contract that needs to be fixed. First, let's start with the terms of confidentiality. I wrote in my playbook, as you can see, the survival period should be greater than 7 years. However, here within the contract, it's limited to 5 years. So just like I would in Word, I can change the contract live in the document itself, and I can make this thumbs up. As I scroll down, we found a non-compete language. And this is really interesting because if you look at the language highlighted here, you'll notice that nowhere in this language does it use the word compete or competition. There's no header, there's no paragraph break. This is the AI being able to realize, based on all the learning it's done until now, that the language herein implies a non-compete. And I can read it and it says that the big hereby agrees that he/she shall not engage in the business of the company or its successors, and say, great, I've now realized this is a non-compete. I push the delete key, it's out the contract, and it's ready to go. Moving down further on, there's an issue with governing law. It says over here that my playbook specifically states we accept New York or Delaware, and the governing law here is state of California. So if I wanted to, I can change this just like I did before and make California New York. But I can say alternatively, well, maybe I know this vendor, maybe I have no real problem with this myself because I've worked with them before. So I can mark this as a question mark, and I can share this with a senior legal professional or a colleague of mine and say, hey, in this case, are we able to accept California? And he can say, or she can say, actually, you know what? Yeah, we know this one, this customer's fine, we're happy to accept it. So I'm now 90% through my review. Finally, one thing which humans are notoriously difficult at, or find much harder, and AI and computers are much better at, is finding missing clauses. By this, I mean being able to say what's not in the contract. Humans are very good often at seeing a contract and saying, okay, this is a problem and this is a problem. But if you say to them, great, what's not there? It's a much harder task. But for a computer and for an AI, essentially it's the same task. So I've noticed here that the standard of care clause is missing. So all I need to do, because I've already defined my sample language here, when I set up this playbook, is click on Add Missing Clause, put it wherever I think it should go in the contract, and click, and it automatically adds it just like it would. I can do the same thing here with data security and privacy. This is language that I previously defined. I click it into the contract, and it's in place. And by doing this, essentially what I'm able to do is review the entire contract in what has been less than 4 minutes. And every single time I review this contract, I get the exact same results, which is incredibly valuable. The consistency level which we are able to offer means that I can check this contract, as I said, 10 o'clock on a Monday morning or 5:30 on the train home on a Friday afternoon and still get the exact same results. Now, you'll notice that it took me 5 or 6 minutes, and that's while going through the review conversation. If I was focusing on doing this properly on a daily basis, I would be able to do this in about 2 or 3 minutes. And again, that level of consistency is there because I'm not reading a whole contract and trying to work out what the issues may be. I'm opening up a report which is saying to me, here are the issues, and here are your recommended fixes based on your own playbook. Once this is all done, I can push the export button. And when I do that, this will create a Word document for me with track changes, just like it would be if I was reviewing it myself. And I can send this straight across to the other side. And it's essentially transparent to them. They have no idea if it was reviewed by a person or a third party or an AI. So in a nutshell, that's contract review automation. It allows you to ingest third-party contracts, highlight issues that need to be fixed, and then fix those issues quickly and consistently every single time. On that note, this brings us to where we hope to be able to possibly ruffle some feathers and possibly not upset some people, but make people ask interesting questions of themselves. And that's our big question of, are you ready for it? This is a big technological leap, and it's quite far away from what most people learn in law school. And therefore, we've compiled 4 questions which to us help us understand whether or not a customer is able to bring on something like this. The first indicator for us is we know that the customer is not ready if they say things like, we're really curious about AI. If you're going into a project like this, hoping to slate a thirst of interest in technology or learn what's out there, most of these projects fail. We would strongly recommend taking on a product like this and a process like this if and only if you actually have a pain around contract review that you need to solve. And this is a very important distinction. If you come to us and say, well, we want to see your solution because we would love to see an AI in action, that normally for us indicates that the person looking at the solution is not mature enough yet within their organization to implement something like this. But if they come to us and say, okay, I don't mind if it's AI, I don't mind if it's humans, I don't mind if it's dancing fairies. We have a problem that we need to solve and we're looking for the best possible solution. That is normally when our pilots are the most successful, our customers are most happy, and the product is best used. Because you're not coming to us to see a solution, you're coming to us to solve a problem. The second thing to note is you're not ready if you say, I'll need to check every contract anyway. Remember again that this solution is built for high volume, low risk contracts. We're talking NDAs, purchase orders, service agreements. Our bread and butter is the type of contracts that your lawyers don't want to have to review. But once you start using a solution like this, then it doesn't help you and it doesn't help us. It's if every single time the AI has checked a contract, you check it again anyway because you don't trust the solution yet. I'm not saying trust it from day one. I'm saying treat this like you would a junior contract clerk. So initially, yes, look over our shoulder. Make sure that everything's in place. Make sure you're happy with the results. But you have to be prepared to get to a position where you say, once it's been checked and once I trust the system, that's enough for me. And this is an important point to make. The legal tech automation revolution, so to speak, is not something that's coming. It's something that's past. We're a 4-year-old company with hundreds of customers around the world, and we have competitors, and we have an industry behind us which is mature, which is rich, and which has been offering services like this for a long time. If you are married to the pen and paper and you're not willing to consider digital technologies, it's going to hinder your ability to impact your business with a solution like this. The same way you're not going to find a lawyer nowadays who says, listen, I won't use email, I won't use Outlook, I still prefer to use the fax machine. This is the next step of the technologies which lawyers use to do their job. And if it's not now, it has to be relatively soon. And if it's not us, it's more than welcome to be somebody else. But the concept of, well, once it's been checked by a human, it's perfect. And if it's been checked by a machine, it's simply not good enough. Nowadays, in 2018, nearly 2019, is simply no longer the case. The third question that we like to ask is that we believe people are ready if they say to us, or they say amongst themselves, why are we spending so much time reviewing contracts? If you recognize that your senior legal team, your experienced lawyers, your most impactful members are, so to speak, spending their time incorrectly reviewing basic procurement agreements and insertion orders that have very low risk and very low value, and you recognize this as being a problem, this misallocation of resources, then you're already over halfway there, because then you're recognizing that certain work should and can be done by certain different people and at certain different levels and with certain different technologies. Yes, your senior lawyers should be dealing with every M&A, all your acquisitions, shareholders agreements, etc. And your junior lawyers should be dealing with purchase orders and service agreements worth, $100,000 or more. And your lowest, let's say, resources, be that your junior team members or procurement members or contract managers, with an aid of an AI tool, should be dealing with the bottom of the rung work, such as NDAs and low-value purchase agreements or service orders. Finally, you are ready if you say, can we not triage these contracts? Now, contract triage is something which is very simple to set up, but still most businesses today don't have a system like this in place. They don't have the processes or the operational people to say, okay, this is now the route for contracts. High-level contracts go to this person. Legal deals with these. Procurement are able to manage these on their own. Any contract with X value or Y value or Z value goes to these individual routes. Once you're putting a system like that in place, then it's very easy to move from that to a point of saying, okay, I'm fully aware that my expensive contracts are now being judged by my best team, and that's perfect. And my lower contracts, they don't need to go to my best team. These can be automated. Essentially, you've recognized the pain in the business and you've done 90% of the work towards solving it without necessarily using any technology at all. Just by realizing that by mapping out the processes, you're going to be doing better. And if you're ready at that stage, then adding automation to help you triage these contracts better and faster is almost always a no-brainer. So at that point, I've covered everything I wanted to go through today. If you take away nothing else, you can now say you've seen a real legal AI in action. It's not scary. It's not going to take your jobs away. It's just going to make your lives easier. Hopefully you've been asking questions throughout. I'd like to remind you again, if you have any further questions, please feel free to write them in now. And Anne and myself will be on the line for the next 20 minutes, half an hour, going through anything that we can to help you out. Anne, over to you.
Well, thank you. That was really interesting. And I had not seen a demo like that before, so I learned a lot. And it brought up a lot of questions for me, so I'm going to throw some questions at you. In the beginning of your program, you showed us the policy center where you basically set up your rules. What level of knowledge do you need to build the rules? Because I'm sure there's some rules behind that we didn't see. Do you have to be a programmer? Is it a pretty easy process to set up the rules? How do you create that, the things that are in that policy center?
So we have a professional services team that set that up by default for each of our customers. The only knowledge you have to know is your own legal policies. That's it. So either if you have it already documented, or if you have sample agreements that we can base it off, or if you have that one person in the team that's been doing this for 30 years and she's able to speak to us and talk us through it, that's all we need to know. There's no programming skills required whatsoever. There's no knowledge of technology or computers. The codification of that legal policy really can take an hour or two and is very, very simple to do.
Well, and then that was my next question is, how long is the implementation process if I decide I want to bring a tool like this into my organization? From the day I decide this is what I have to have, how long does it take to get it to where it can analyze a contract in 5 minutes like we just saw?
So the honest answer is that it can take an hour or two. Our AI is fully pre-trained. So from the day you start using us, we are ready to go. You need to set up a playbook. You need to create usernames for the people on your team. With change management and sharing things internally and onboarding team members, sometimes this can take a week or two. But from the technical side of it, we're ready to go the minute you create your first account with us.
Okay. We have a question in the queue that I want to jump to. The question is, does the AI classify each clause in the contract, or is this done manually before applying the rules?
That's all the AI. That's exactly what the AI does. The AI reads the contract and classifies each and every clause. And then once the AI has done that, it compares it to the playbook that you created when you set the system up.
Okay, and then follow on one in here. I'm curious about the data storage. Is this all on the cloud, or is it local storage at where it is implemented?
This is completely cloud-based, so you can access the solution from anywhere in the world, and you can upload contracts from wherever you are. Our servers are currently based in Houston, Texas, but we are able to open servers in any regions based on the customer's needs.
So in response to one of those audience questions, you had talked about the AI reading the clauses. How does the AI identify that, for example, you have a choice of law clause here? I mean, has that been trained somewhere? Is there a training phase that goes on here, or how does it know how to identify what clauses are in the contract and read them?
So we've spent the last 4 years training the AI. So our AI is fully pre-trained. Over the last 4 years, we've seen upwards of 600,000 contracts and millions of different variations and tens of millions of different language meaning the same thing. And essentially, our AI is now able to distinguish between those clauses because it's been trained so rigorously over the last few years. So when a customer starts using us, we are up and running, ready to go, no training required whatsoever.
Okay, so no training on the customer's part because in the development of the technology, you've had access to very large data sets where you basically built your AI based on those.
Exactly.
Okay, so there's lots of talk these days about data sets and the right kind of data sets and the wrong kind of data sets. And did you have any issues when you were developing this with getting that much data? Because it sounds like a huge amount of data that you have used, and I'm sure you got a lot of benefit from that. And were there any problems in those data sets? And where I'm going with this question is sometimes organizations that decide they want to implement AI are at a point where they're deciding, do I buy it or do I build it? And so maybe talk a little bit about some of the hurdles and obstacles you had to go through in building it. And one of them I can think of probably may have dealt with getting the data set, but there may be others too. But let's talk about the data set first.
Yeah, so it was a huge effort. So getting the data set, getting the information themselves was a lot of work by a large team over here. We used the Freedom of Information Act to ask a whole bunch of organizations to send us their signed contracts, and then those that, as you can imagine, very few said yes. Those that didn't reply or said no, we had to really push to get. We used a lot of pre-published information, contracts from companies that have been through court and therefore were made public. It took us a very long time, what we called contract acquisition, which is collecting, sorting, and actually cleaning up all those contracts to go into the system. And we also have fully trained and very experienced teams of data scientists and data engineers here who essentially review and sometimes manually, sometimes automatically annotate every single contract that goes through the system. So this was a lot of clever people working very hard over 4 years just to ensure that the data that went into the AI was of the best possible quality. Because as you know, as they say, garbage in, garbage out. And building that accurate corpus of annotated contracts was a monumental effort.
Wow, that's fascinating. I never would have guessed you would have been doing FOIA requests to get contracts to build a data set, but that's really interesting. So
Eventually, as I
obviously
said, it's hard effort, but it works.
You as an organization didn't have a body of data. Potentially, if you're a Hewlett Packard or an IBM or some Microsoft, some huge organization, you might have enough volume to build your own data set, but a lot of organizations aren't going to. And so that was quite a process for you guys to build the data set. That's really interesting.
That's true, but remember, it's not just a question of data set size. A lot of the largest organizations may have this data, but it's spread throughout hundreds of systems and sitting in a whole bunch of e-boxes and inboxes. And it would probably take a couple of years just to collect all the information and put it in one place in the same format and the same input, parameters before you can even start ingesting this data.
Well, and that's a great point. So even if it is within the organization, it might not be much easier than what you had to go through because there's still quite a process to collect and standardize it. Interesting. Okay, so we have a couple more questions that are coming in. One's about encryption, and particularly for your solution, is the data going back and forth between the server encrypted, and then is it encrypted at rest on the server?
Yes, I like that question because whoever asked it clearly knows what they are talking about. All our data is fully encrypted in transit and at rest. So while it's sitting on our server, it's encrypted. And while it's moving between the customer's screen, so to speak, and our servers, everything's fully SSL encrypted.
Great. Okay, let me keep going through what we have here. Okay, follow on to the data question. Is the data solely used by the customer who put it there, the one who uploaded their documents, or is it also accessed by LawGeeks for any other purposes, maybe to improve your AI, make it smarter, add to your data set?
So no, it's a very good question. We don't use customer data to improve the accuracy of our AI. As of now, our AI is more accurate than a human is. And this has been tested and verified by several universities and law colleges in the US. So we don't need to add another contract to make the system more intelligent, so to speak. We can, and sometimes we do access our client's data when we need to QA a contract. So for example, if language there is mentioned and we don't know what it is, and the algorithm says, well, I've never seen this before, or the algorithm says, for example, well, this might be non-compete or might be non-solicitation, then we have a human QA team, which is made up of US bar past lawyers, which essentially will open up that one paragraph or that one line of text and say, okay, this isn't a non-compete, it actually is a non-solicitation. And then when that contract goes back to the customer, everything looks green and everything looks fine. So we have a human QA process in the loop when needed that we can call on, but we don't use customers' data to improve the algorithm further.
Okay, here's another question on the data sets. This data set piece is actually kind of fascinating to me. Would using contracts that had been in litigation as part of your training set introduce some type of bias to the training? Because presumably these contracts were in litigation because there was a problem with the contract.
It is an
So if that was a
excellent
bad
question.
clause, for example.
It's an excellent question, but I want to remind you again, the contracts that we deal with are NDAs. When was the last time you heard of an NDA being litigated? If our entire data set came from NDAs going to courts, we'd probably have 3 contracts and that would be it. Our focus is on low value, low risk, very high volume contracts, catering agreements, renting out a space for an exhibition, printers. If you have your printer breaks down and somebody's coming to fix it and they need to come in the next few hours, so they send over a service agreement. If you give that to legal, you then have to wait 7 days. But if you can sign it yourself in under an hour with LawGeeks, business can move forward. And those are the contracts that we deal with. If a contract has been truly litigated, it's probably not something that you're going to be running through LawGeeks anyway. So there's no litigation bias because we're not getting our contracts from litigation, because the type of contracts that we deal with, low value service agreements, advertising insertion orders, IT software licenses and SaaS agreements, these aren't litigated.
So when you were showing us the way the software worked, you had a column that indicated if a particular clause was acceptable or not, correct?
That's correct.
What kind of logic goes into making the determination of a clause that's present but is not acceptable versus is acceptable? How does that work from the technology side?
Well, from the technology side, it's relatively simple. The AI sees whether or not the clause is there, and if it is, it matches it to the yes or no that was previously assigned by whatever lawyer or legal professional set up the playbook. So a lawyer can say, for example, that governing law is acceptable, and within the governing law clause, New York is acceptable and California is not acceptable. So then when the AI sees the paragraph, first of all, it determines, is it governing law? Yes. Should it be there? Yes. We're great. And then it reads where the location is, and it can says governing law is set to New York, and it can say checks against the playbook. That's greenlit, we're good to go. So in that case, it wouldn't even flag it up to the lawyer to say, check this paragraph, check this clause, because it knows that the clause should be there and is, and you know that it should say New York and is. If it said California, then it would flag it to you and say, hey, read this paragraph, it's present but not acceptable.
So it's not satisfying one of the policies in the playbook, essentially, right? The clause, it can identify that type of clause is present, but something about it doesn't satisfy the policy that's applied to that type of clause. In your example, it would be it's the wrong state for choice of law, right?
Correct. And further than that, as I showed previously, it's also able to pick up on whether or not a specific clause shouldn't be there at all. For example, if I'm signing a service agreement, I could say that I'll never accept a non-compete. So if a non-compete is present, it should always be unacceptable. So whenever language comes up which indicates a non-compete, it should be flagged and shown to the end user.
Well, and that sounds like that's one of the really valuable components of your tool. I mean, there are many, but that's a really valuable one. So again, from the technology side, there must be some kind of a essentially gold standard, or basically it's your policies that you're comparing against. And then if you're finding something in the clause that isn't in those policies, is that where you get flagged? There shouldn't be a non-compete in my NDA?
Yeah, essentially that's it.
Okay, cool. We got a few more questions. So breaking down the 600,000 document training set, what is the breakdown of the 600,000 document training set between NDAs and purchase agreements?
Good question. Roughly a third are NDAs, and the other 2/3 are procurement agreements, such as purchase agreements, service agreements, software licenses, insertion orders. For each contract type, we have several tens of thousands to ensure that we have more than enough accuracy in order to actually run the algorithms themselves.
All right, here's another one. Catching false positives is easy as the system is failing safe, but how do you handle false negatives?
It's an excellent question. My question is right back at you. How do you catch false negatives with human lawyers? You're taking on less of a risk than if you're taking on a junior associate. And something which is very interesting, our algorithms have an accuracy of 94%. And again, those aren't our numbers, these are numbers put forward by Yale and other major universities who have tested our algorithms. But an average human lawyer to pass a bar exam needs 60% in some states, 75% in some states. So it's very simple for us to say, well, there's still a 6% error if you're only 94% accurate. But consistently, when humans are tested by other humans and how well they do at tasks such as issue spotting in a contract, they score somewhere between 75 to 85%. So yes, there's an associated risk. There will always be an associated risk, but I could mathematically argue it's less of a risk than if you give it to a human.
Interesting. So then, following on that comment about the risk in giving it to a human, another question from the audience is, do you advocate that a lawyer do any sample or spot checking, or is there no need for manual checking?
I would recommend, especially early on, to do spot checking. But let me be clear, that's not necessarily to review the output of the AI, but because, like you would with any junior associate, you need to make sure that the results you're getting are the results you want. Everything here is editable and tweakable to make sure that it gets to your standards. And once it is at your standards, you need to trust a system like this, which means that you need to be able to open it up at any time and read through a couple of contracts and be happy with the results and then put it back down again and pick it up when you need that trust built again. We want to make solutions that make people's lives better and make lawyers more comfortable. And if you're constantly going to be worrying that we're missing something, this was one of the points I made earlier. This may not be the tool for you. But if you are willing to test it and test it extensively, days, weeks, months, however long it needs till you've built that trust up, and then from that point forward, trust the system. The same way that people do with GPS when it first came out, or email when it first came out. I remember very clearly the first time people sent emails, they then called the other side and said, hey, did you get the email? And you know what? 1 out of 1,000, they didn't get it because it was stuck in a spam filter, or you thought you had signal on your phone when you sent it, but you didn't, or the attachment was too big. Things break, but nobody today doesn't intrinsically trust email. Nobody today sends an email and then sends a follow-up fax to make sure that you got the email. And it's the same with any technology. Please remember, more than anything else, call it AI or not, it's essentially a piece of technology. It's still fundamentally a software, like spell check. When you're working in Word and you push Control F to find all versions of this, I would argue most people today don't then read through the contract to see if there was another version of that which was not found, because they trust